What if I told you? A 16-year-old girl wearing thrift store jeans and carrying nothing but a worn-out notebook walked into one of the most prestigious math departments in the country, faced down professors, silenced doubters, and solved a problem that no one else could crack for years. They told her, "Don't try to be a hero. It's impossible to solve." Her answer? "Sir, just give me 3 minutes." Stick around, because this true story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about talent, privilege, and raw determination. And hey, if you love hearing stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss another inspiring story in our series. Your support helps keep these voices heard. Don't try to be a hero. It's impossible to solve. The words rang through the air like a slap. Professor Aldridge's voice was sharp, dismissive, and loaded with decades of academic arrogance. The entire lecture hall at Preston University, one of the most elite mathematics departments on the East Coast, had gone silent. Dozens of students, graduate researchers, and faculty members froze mid-scribble, all eyes fixed on the center of attention. At the front of the massive chalkboard stood Amara Johnson, a 16-year-old girl from South Carolina, her hands trembling slightly but her gaze steady. Her dark curls were pulled back into a simple ponytail, and she wore faded jeans with a thrift store denim jacket, an outfit that looked painfully out of place amid rows of cashmere sweaters and tailored suits. She gripped a piece of chalk in her right hand like it was her only weapon. Just minutes earlier, Professor Aldridge had unveiled the equation, a monstrous, unsolved problem in nonlinear stochastic systems, something that had stumped senior faculty for years. The board was covered with symbols, Greek letters, and long strings of convoluted operators that twisted across the slate like an unsolvable riddle. "This problem," Aldridge had said earlier, "has no known solution. We've consulted experts from MIT, Stanford, even visiting scholars from Cambridge. No one has cracked it. Today, it's here for academic discussion, nothing more." The room had laughed. A few smug smiles, a few sarcastic whispers. Then, in a voice just above a whisper, Amara had spoken from the back row. "Sir, give me just 3 minutes." Heads had turned. A few chuckles rose. Someone from the front muttered, "Who even let her in here?" Amara's seat at this prestigious workshop hadn't been earned through legacy, privilege, or Ivy League prep schools. She had won an obscure national math challenge for underrepresented youth, a competition hardly anyone here had heard of. Her reward? A single-day pass to observe this elite university's annual mathematics symposium. Observe, not participate. Definitely not challenge the department head on stage. But here she was. Professor Aldridge narrowed his eyes, studying her like a lab experiment gone rogue. 3 minutes? He repeated, the corner of his mouth twitching in amusement. "And what do you expect to accomplish in that time, Miss Johnson, Amara Johnson?" There was a pause. Then Aldridge waved toward the chalkboard with dramatic flair. "Very well, entertain us." A few students stifled laughter. Some pulled out their phones, ready to capture the embarrassment they were sure would follow. Amara stepped forward, clutching her small, beat-up spiral notebook close to her chest. Her heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear herself think. But she had prepared for moments like this her whole life, even if she never expected one to look quite like this. 2 days earlier, South Carolina Amara had been sitting on the worn front porch of her grandmother's house, flipping through an old copy of Advanced Probability Models when the letter arrived. A large manila envelope with the Preston University seal stamped on the front. Her hands shook as she tore it open. Inside, a formal invitation to the annual mathematics symposium, a day pass as a special observer. Details about the event, the keynote speaker, and the special challenge presentation. Her grandmother, watching nearby, asked softly, "Are you finally going to show them what you're made of, baby girl?" Amara smiled nervously but said nothing. By the time she arrived at the university 2 days later, she already felt the weight of being an outsider. No one smiled at her when she checked in. A security guard double-checked her credentials like she was trespassing. At the auditorium, students shifted uncomfortably when she sat too close to them. Her denim jacket, her sneakers, her accent. Everything about her screamed that she didn't belong. But math had always made sense. Math didn't care where she came from. Math didn't care how she dressed. Math just needed to be solved. Back to present, the lecture hall. As Amara raised the chalk to the board, 1,000 doubts screamed inside her head. She ignored them. The first line she wrote wasn't bold. Her handwriting was small but steady. Her approach: start with an identity transform on the boundary conditions, something nobody had dared consider because it seemed too simple for such a complex problem. The room grew quieter. Aldridge's smirk faltered just a bit. Amara glanced over her shoulder, took a deep breath, and whispered to herself, "Let my work speak for me." Amara's hand moved faster now, chalk scratching softly across the board. Her breathing slowed as her focus narrowed. Every sound in the room faded, the shifting of chairs, the whispers, the quiet laughter. None of it mattered. All that existed was the equation in front of her, and the quiet rhythm of her thoughts. She began with a non-obvious substitution, shifting the domain of the integral into a more manageable form. Then, using an unconventional application of a stochastic convergence theorem, she started simplifying what had once looked like mathematical chaos. Lines of elegant logic unfolded where, moments ago, there had only been noise. Students sitting in the front rows exchanged glances. A few leaned forward. One of the graduate assistants stopped mid-text and lowered his phone, his eyes narrowing at the unfolding work. Professor Aldridge, standing stiff near the side of the board, crossed his arms, his earlier amusement thinning into something closer to suspicion. "Interesting choice of variables," he said dryly. "Where did you learn that?" Amara didn't look at him. "Self-study," she answered quietly, her voice steady now. "And some tricks my uncle taught me. He used to tutor college students in applied mathematics." Someone in the audience gasped softly as Amara manipulated a notoriously unstable term, converting it with a change of measure that none of the PhD students had even considered. For the first time all morning, no one dared speak. The lecture hall was holding its collective breath. 3 minutes stretched to 5. 5 turned to 8. When she finally stepped back, the entire left side of the board had transformed. The chaotic sprawl of unsolvable variables had been condensed, rewritten, and reframed into a streamlined, solvable form. A young postdoc sitting near the window blinked in disbelief and muttered, That's actually a working path." Aldridge stepped forward, adjusting his glasses, examining every step, every transformation. The professor remained silent for a long time. Then, in a low voice, he said, "Show me the next phase." Amara nodded and picked up the chalk again. She walked to the next section of the board and began explaining, slowly this time, each step she'd taken, each substitution, each reason why she had approached the problem this way. Her explanations weren't full of academic jargon. They were simple, precise, and incredibly logical. By the time she reached the final reduction, a low murmur began sweeping the room. "I can't believe she caught that symmetry." She used a non-standard stochastic inversion. I haven't seen anyone apply that here before. She actually mapped the unstable node. A graduate student near the front looked up, whispering, "Who is she?" Aldridge finally raised a hand, silencing the chatter. "We're not done yet," he said. "This is just Phase 1. The professor turned, and with a few swift strokes, wrote the next segment of the problem on the board. A far more brutal, non-linear coupling of variables, intentionally designed to collapse most known methods. "This is where everyone gets stuck," he said pointedly, his eyes fixed on Amara now. Amara stepped back for a second, scanning the new segment. Her heart picked up speed again, but she forced herself to breathe slowly. Her mind spun, cycling through every technique she'd studied late at night, every trick, every theorem, every random page she'd bookmarked in dusty library books. For the first time, her hands trembled slightly. From the front row, a familiar voice cut through the tension. "Don't strain yourself, farm girl," sneered one of the senior undergrads, a tall boy named Ethan Rowe, known around campus for being both brilliant and brutal with his words. "You had your lucky 3 minutes." A few chuckles rose from the back. Amara's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. Instead, she grabbed the eraser, cleared a section of the board, and began working again. This time, she shifted approach, moving into spectral analysis, applying a contour deformation technique she'd only read about once in a research paper buried deep in a university archive. Aldridge's expression changed. The arrogance faded. For the first time, true curiosity, and maybe a flicker of worry, appeared in his eyes. The students watched, some sitting at the edge of their seats, others completely frozen. One whispered, "No way she's pulling this off." Another murmured, wait, is that the start of a viable path?" Amara's internal dialogue raced. Shift to Laplace domain, approximate the nonlinear perturbation, isolate the dominant eigenvalue, track the instability boundary. Her chalk moved faster now, her brain fully in flow state. Minutes passed. Somewhere in the back of the hall, a faculty member stood up, walking toward the board for a better look. When Amara paused again, the room burst into scattered murmurs. Someone clapped once, reflexively, then stopped, as if unsure if applause was even allowed in this AMA. The buzz inside the lecture hall didn't fade even after Amara sat down. Conversations erupted in hushed voices, some students still staring at the board, others pulling out their phones to snap photos of her work before it was erased. Ethan Rowe, still seated at the front, shook his head in disbelief, muttering something under his breath. A few students nearby exchanged glances, their earlier smugness replaced with uncertainty. Professor Aldridge remained frozen for several long seconds. Then, with visible effort, he stepped forward, grabbed the eraser and wiped the board clean in deliberate strokes. His jaw tightened with every swipe. "Break's over," he said sharply, his voice cold now. "Next session starts in 10 minutes. Students began gathering their belongings, but no one really moved far. The energy in the room had shifted, and everyone knew it. As Amara stood to leave, she felt a gentle tap on her shoulder. Turning, she found herself face to face with a woman she hadn't noticed before. Mid-40s, glasses perched low on her nose, and a kind but focused expression. She wore a navy blue blazer with a university emblem stitched on the pocket. "Amara Johnson?" the woman asked. "Yes, ma'am." "I'm Dr. Celeste Monroe, visiting from Stanford's Department of Mathematical Physics." She offered a small smile. "Would you have a few minutes to speak after the afternoon session?" Amara blinked, caught off guard. Sure, of course. Dr. Monroe nodded approvingly. "Good, I'll find you." Before Amara could process what had just happened, another voice interrupted from behind. "Well, that was a performance." Amara turned to see Ethan standing a few feet away, arms crossed, wearing a crooked, insincere grin. "You do realize this isn't a talent show, right?" he said, lowering his voice just enough for nearby students to overhear. "One trick doesn't make you a genius." Amara held his gaze without flinching. "It wasn't a trick." Ethan scoffed. "Sure. Let's see how long you last once the real work starts." Without waiting for a reply, he turned and walked off, leaving a trail of bitter energy behind him. Amara exhaled slowly. She wasn't surprised. People like Ethan existed everywhere, louder, taller, richer, and often more afraid than they let on. Still, a seed of doubt crept into her mind. Was this really where she belonged? Could she survive in a world where everyone assumed she didn't? As she exited the hall, Amara pulled out her phone. There was only one message waiting for her, a text from her grandmother back home. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone but yourself. Proud of you already." Amara smiled faintly and slid the phone back into her pocket. The rest of the afternoon sessions blurred by. Theorems, proofs, dense lectures. Most of it went over the heads of even the senior students. Amara did her best to absorb what she could, taking furious notes, even when her understanding lagged behind. Occasionally, she caught glimpses of Aldridge glancing her way, his face unreadable. When the final session ended, Amara packed her things and headed toward the small cafe on campus as instructed. Dr. Monroe was already waiting at a corner table near the window. "Sit, please," the professor said warmly, motioning to the seat across from her. For a moment, they sat in silence as Amara wrapped her hands around a cup of tea that Monroe had already ordered for her. Finally, Monroe leaned forward. "You have no idea what you just did, do you?" Amara frowned. I solved part of the equation, I think." Monroe chuckled softly. "That problem. It's been a thorn in this department's side for nearly 3 years. Graduate students have spent entire semesters trying to untangle even a fraction of it. And today, in front of all of them, you made a dent. A real one." Amara lowered her gaze, unsure how to respond. Monroe's tone softened further. "Listen, there are going to be people who resent you for this, people like Aldridge, and that boy, Ethan, but there are others, people like me, who see exactly what you are." "And what's that?" Amara asked cautiously. "Rare," Monroe said simply. "Very, very rare." Before Amara could reply, Monroe's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her brow furrowing. "Excuse me for a moment," she said, standing and stepping outside to take the call. Left alone at the table, Amara looked out across the campus courtyard. Students walked in groups, laughing, talking, carrying backpacks heavier than their frames. Most of them looked like they'd been here for years, like they belonged. For the first time since arriving, Amara felt something other than fear, possibility. But that feeling didn't last long. Across the courtyard, she spotted Ethan and 2 other students huddled together. One of them pointed toward her. Another laughed. Ethan's eyes narrowed, and though she couldn't hear what he said, Amara could read the look on his face. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And somehow, she welcomed that. That night, Amara lay awake in the small guest dormitory Preston University had reserved for symposium visitors. The room smelled faintly of old textbooks and floor wax. Outside her window, the lights of campus buildings flickered, casting long shadows on the courtyard below. Her notebook lay open across her lap, pages filled with scribbles, half-finished proofs, and margin notes in different colored inks. Her brain wouldn't rest. Every time she closed her eyes, fragments of the problem from earlier swirled through her mind like restless equations demanding resolution. Her phone buzzed, a new email, subject, invitation, private advanced problem-solving session. From Professor Martin Aldridge. Amara's stomach tightened as she opened it. Miss Johnson, following today's demonstration, I would like to formally invite you to participate in a private advanced mathematics problem-solving session tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. in room 302, Whitaker Hall. This session is reserved for select doctoral candidates and visiting scholars. Attendance is optional. Regards, Professor M. Aldridge. Amara stared at the screen for a long time. Optional. She knew exactly what that meant. This wasn't an opportunity. It was a test, a quiet, unspoken challenge. Either show up and survive, or don't show at all and be forgotten. She exhaled slowly, closed her notebook, and set an early alarm. By 7:45 the next morning, Amara stood outside room 302. Her palms were sweaty despite the crisp morning air. The hallway was empty except for a janitor mopping the far end. She pushed open the door. Inside, a long conference table dominated the room. Seated around it were 5 individuals, 3 doctoral students, 1 visiting fellow from Cambridge, and Professor Aldridge himself at the head. And sitting at the far end, Ethan Rowe. He smirked when he saw her. Didn't think you'd show, he said under his breath. Aldridge didn't greet her. Take a seat, Miss Johnson, he said, without looking up from a stack of papers. Amara slid into the only available chair near the corner. Aldridge stood, cleared his throat, and handed out sealed envelopes to everyone at the table. Inside each envelope, he began, is a multi-step proof challenge. Each addresses a different field: topology, applied statistics, and nonlinear dynamics. You'll have 90 minutes. Collaboration is not permitted. No electronic devices. Only your minds and what's in front of you. He gestured toward a side table stacked with blank notebooks and sharpened pencils. Ethan grabbed his materials with a lazy swagger, smirking toward Amara before opening his envelope. Amara did the same. Her heart sank immediately. The first problem was brutal. A topology question involving homology groups on a non-orientable manifold. She had read about it only once, late at night, buried inside an old textbook she borrowed from the county library back home. The second problem, an applied statistics scenario, was even worse. Nested variables, incomplete data sets, missing parameters. Deliberately nasty. The third, a nonlinear system equation, structurally similar to yesterday's monster, but with altered conditions designed to trip her. The clock on the wall ticked louder than it should. Amara closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, and began. First problem. Topology. Her pencil moved in short, sharp bursts. She drew diagrams in the margin, mapping the surfaces in her mind, testing assumptions, flipping perspectives like her uncle had taught her. Half an hour passed before she saw a path through. Second problem, statistics. Harder, more tangled. But she remembered an old trick. Bootstrapping small data sets using Monte Carlo simulations. Crude, but functional. She built a partial solution, double-checked her work, and moved on. By the time she reached the third problem, only 20 minutes remained. She stared at the nonlinear system, heart pounding. Her mind raced through possible transforms. Laplace? No, not fast enough. Fourier? Maybe. Change of variables? Possible, but risky. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed Ethan, already finished. Sitting back with folded arms, a smug grin on his face like he'd already won. Amara gritted her teeth, refocused, and let instinct take over. Her pencil scratched furiously across the page. 15 minutes left. 10, 5, time. Aldridge called out. Notebooks closed. Amara dropped her pencil, her hands shaking. One by one, the students handed in their work. Ethan practically tossed his notebook on the table like it was a trophy. Aldridge collected the stack without comment. Then, for the first time all morning, he looked directly at Amara. "No matter the outcome," he said quietly, "you certainly don't lack persistence." It wasn't a compliment, but it wasn't pure dismissal either. As the others filed out, Ethan lingered near the door. "Enjoy your free ride while it lasts," he muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. Amara said nothing. She didn't have to, because deep down, she already knew. Whatever came next, she wasn't backing down, not now, not ever. By late afternoon, Amara sat curled up in the corner of the campus library, surrounded by books taller than her backpack. The anxiety from the morning hadn't fully left her. Every few minutes, she found herself glancing at her phone, waiting for an email that hadn't arrived. Her notebook lay open, pages covered in partial solutions, practice problems, and nervous doodles in the margins. The soft hum of whispered conversations and the occasional clatter of keyboards filled the air around her. Suddenly, a voice interrupted her thoughts. "Amara Johnson." She looked up. Standing there was Dr. Celeste Monroe again, holding a takeaway coffee in one hand and a folder in the other. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Amara shook her head quickly. "Not at all." Monroe sat down across from her, placing the folder carefully on the table. "I've reviewed the preliminary scoring from this morning's session," Monroe said, keeping her voice low. Amara's stomach twisted. "And? Let's just say, some people are not pleased with the results," Monroe said, giving her a knowing look. Amara blinked. "Wait, are you saying You didn't just hold your own," Monroe said. "You outscored 3 of the doctoral candidates, including Ethan Rowe." Amara's mouth fell open. "But don't expect anyone to celebrate that fact publicly," Monroe added, voice dropping to a near whisper. "Professor Aldridge hasn't circulated the results yet. He's deliberating." Amara's heart sank again. Of course. "They're looking for ways to explain it away," she guessed. Monroe nodded. "Something like that." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Monroe leaned in slightly. "Listen, I'm going to be blunt with you. This place, it wasn't built for kids like you. The politics here, the layers of unspoken rules. It'll wear you down if you let it." Amara swallowed hard. "But if you can survive this, if you can keep doing what you're doing, you'll change more than just your own future," Monroe said. Amara absorbed that, unsure how to respond. Before she could speak, Monroe pushed the folder toward her. "Inside is something I want you to study. It's an open research problem I've been working on for the last 6 months. No one's cracked it yet." Amara's eyes widened. "You want me to try solving it?" "I want to see how you think," Monroe said. "You have a different lens. Sometimes that's exactly what we need." Amara carefully opened the folder. Lines of complex probability theory, stochastic differentials, and spectral transforms filled the pages. It looked impossible, which only made her more determined. The next morning, she arrived early at Whitaker Hall again, determined to find a quiet corner to work before anyone else arrived. But as she climbed the staircase toward the study lounge, she heard voices, sharp, angry voices, coming from one of the conference rooms. Pausing near the door, she caught snippets of conversation. "Can't allow this precedent. It undermines the standards we've fought to maintain." one test isn't enough proof of long-term ability. She's an observer, not even a registered student. Amara's stomach twisted. There was no mistaking who they were talking about. Suddenly, she heard Aldridge's voice cut through the others. "We'll settle this with one final evaluation," he said, cold and clear. "A comprehensive proof problem. No partial credit, no room for error." Someone else added, "If she fails, that's the end of it." Amara's chest tightened. Then, as quietly as she could, she slipped away before anyone noticed her. Her hands trembled as she gripped the stairwell railing, but after a few slow breaths, she straightened her shoulders and pulled out her notebook. Another test? Fine, let them bring it. If they wanted to see what she was made of, they were about to find out. By noon, the official email landed in her inbox. Subject: Final evaluation, comprehensive proof. Examination: From Office of Academic Affairs, Preston University. Miss Johnson, you are hereby invited to participate in a closed session evaluation designed to assess comprehensive mathematical reasoning and proof construction across multiple disciplines. The session will commence tomorrow at 9 a.m. in room 410, Whitaker Hall. Duration: 3 hours. Materials permitted: chalk, paper, and institutional reference texts. No electronic devices. Best regards, Office of Academic Affairs. Amara read the email twice. Then again. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to stay calm. Closing her laptop, she packed her notebook and headed straight for the campus library. She spent the next 6 hours reviewing everything she could think of: topology, functional analysis, probability theory, Fourier transforms, even discrete mathematics. Her notes became a blur of diagrams and hastily scribbled theorems. Her hands cramped. Her back ached. But she didn't stop. When the clock struck midnight, she dragged herself back to the dorm, barely able to keep her eyes open. Before collapsing onto her bed, she glanced at her phone. One unread text from her grandmother. "No matter what happens tomorrow, you already won in my eyes. Let them see who you are." Amara smiled softly, heart steadying. She set her alarm for 6 a.m. and fell into a restless sleep. By the time she arrived outside room 410 the next morning, a small crowd had gathered in the hallway. Faculty members, graduate students, even a few undergrads had shown up, pretending to study nearby, but all clearly waiting for news. Amara could feel the weight of their stares. Ethan Rowe stood leaning against the far wall, arms crossed, wearing his usual smirk. He locked eyes with her but said nothing. Dr. Munro appeared just before the hour, offering Amara a brief nod of encouragement. Professor Aldridge entered last, holding a thick, sealed envelope marked with the university's crest. Without fanfare, he unlocked the door. "Miss Johnson," he said, voice devoid of emotion. "Inside. You'll have 3 hours. We'll observe from the adjoining room." Amara stepped inside. The room was cold, empty except for a single chair, a table, and the enormous blackboard that stretched across the front wall. Aldridge placed the envelope on the desk in front of her. "When you're ready," he said. Amara nodded. Her hands trembled only slightly as she tore the seal. Inside were 8 dense pages of tightly printed mathematical notation. The problem was unlike anything she'd seen before. An integrated multi-part proof weaving through measure theory, algebraic topology, and stochastic partial differential equations. It was clearly designed for one purpose: to break her. Her heart thudded in her chest. For a brief second she thought about walking out, but instead, she smiled. Challenge accepted. First, she took 2 minutes just to read, really read, every line. She didn't pick up the chalk, didn't make a single mark, just stared at the paper and let her mind map out the terrain. Then, slowly, methodically, She stood and approached the board. She started with the topology segment, mapping the structure, defining boundaries, marking critical points. Her writing was clean, deliberate, confident. From the observation room behind the one-way glass, faculty members leaned forward. One professor whispered, "She's bypassing the common trap." Another murmured, "She's shifting dimensional perspectives. That's a grad-level maneuver." Aldridge stood with his arms crossed, jaw tight, watching her every move. An hour passed. Amara transitioned into the measure theory portion, carefully constructing her proof framework. She left no assumptions unexamined, no step unjustified. Every line flowed logically to the next. From the hallway, more students gathered, waiting for updates. Inside the observation room, someone pulled up the preliminary scoring rubric. "Her logical flow is near perfect," another professor said quietly. At the 2-hour mark, Amara moved on to the final and most brutal section, the nonlinear stochastic component. This was the killer, the part designed to unravel her. Sweat beaded at her temple as she paused, scanning the dense web of variables and operators. Then, she remembered something. A single page from Dr. Monroe's research folder, an obscure application of stochastic Green's functions for boundary approximations. Her pulse steadied. Amara erased part of her earlier work and began a fresh approach, applying the method with surgical precision. From behind the glass, Monroe's eyes widened slightly. "She's doing it," she whispered. Minutes ticked down. With only 3 minutes left, Amara boxed her final answer at the bottom corner of the board. She stepped back, breathing hard, chalk dust covering her fingers. Aldridge entered, followed by the other professors. The room went silent. They began reviewing. Line by line, term by term, wordlessly. 15 minutes later, Aldridge turned, folding his arms across his chest. Without looking at her, he said simply, "This is correct." A stunned hush fell over the room. Then, from the hallway, a single clap rang out, followed by another, and then another, until the entire corridor erupted in spontaneous applause. Amara stood frozen, wide-eyed, staring at the professors as if unsure she'd heard them right. Aldridge, still stoic, gave her a single, begrudging nod before walking out. Dr. Monroe lingered, smiling at her like a proud mentor. Amara blinked, heart racing, tears burning behind her eyes. But she didn't cry, she just smiled, quiet, steady, unshakable. Word of what happened inside room 410 spread like wildfire across campus. By the next morning, anonymous posts appeared on university forums. The girl in denim just aced Aldridge's killer proof. History made in Whitaker Hall. First time in 10 years anyone's cleared all 3 parts. Amara couldn't walk across campus without feeling eyes on her. Some students offered quick nods, others stared with barely disguised curiosity. A few avoided eye contact altogether, their pride wounded by her success. When she entered the library later that day, she found a group of graduate students clustered near the math section. They fell silent as she passed. Ethan Rowe stood among them, arms crossed, face flushed with frustration. Their eyes met for just a moment. He looked away first. Inside, Amara smiled, but she knew this wasn't over. It never really would be. At least not here. That afternoon, a formal summons arrived in her email. Subject, Admissions Committee, Special Session, regarding Miss Amara Johnson. Her heart skipped. This was it, the final hurdle. The next day, she stood before a long, polished oak table in the university's administrative building. Around it sat 12 voting members, senior professors, deans, and external alumni advisors. At the far end sat Professor Aldridge, stone-faced as ever. To her left, Dr. Monroe offered a supportive nod. Dean Ellery, a tall woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, cleared her throat and opened the session. "Miss Johnson," she began, "you stand here today because your performance over the past week has raised considerable debate within this committee." Amara stood still, notebook clutched tightly in her hands. "On one hand," the dean continued, "your mathematical skill is, frankly, undeniable." A few heads around the table nodded in reluctant agreement. "However," Ellery pressed on, "this university has traditions, Miss Johnson, admissions processes, standards that have been built and protected for generations. Your presence here was only meant to be temporary." Murmurs followed. Amara's throat tightened, but she kept her gaze steady. Aldridge spoke next, voice cold and carefully measured. "Miss Johnson," he said, "you are clearly gifted. But this is not a place for singular moments of brilliance alone. It demands consistency, discipline, pedigree." Silence. Then, for the first time, Dr. Monroe spoke. "With all due respect," she said, her voice strong and clear, "perhaps what this institution really needs is a reminder that brilliance doesn't always come packaged the way we expect." Her words hung in the air like a challenge. Some members of the committee shifted uncomfortably. One of the older alumni leaned forward. "Miss Johnson," he said, peering at her over thick glasses, "why do you want to be here, with all the resistance you've clearly faced?" Amara's heart pounded. She swallowed hard. And then she answered. "Because math doesn't care where I'm from," she said simply. "Because I've worked for this. Because I'm not afraid of being underestimated." A pause. "And because, whether you let me stay or not, I'm not done proving myself." The room went still. For a moment no one moved. Then Dean Ellery spoke again. "We will convene privately for a vote." Amara was escorted out to wait in the hallway. The minutes dragged. Students and faculty passed by, glancing at her as though they all knew what was happening behind those closed doors. Finally, the door opened. "Miss Johnson," Dean Ellery called. Amara stood, heart racing, and walked back inside. The dean folded her hands on the table. "The committee has voted," she said, her voice steady. And then, effective immediately, "you are hereby offered full admission to Preston University under special academic standing, with a full scholarship." Amara froze. For a second, she couldn't breathe. She blinked, making sure she heard right. Dr. Monroe smiled softly. Aldridge remained stone-faced, saying nothing. But Amara didn't care. She exhaled, long and slow. "Thank you," she said, her voice shaking but proud. The dean nodded once. "Welcome to Preston University." Amara stepped out into the hallway. The light seemed brighter, the air cleaner. She stood there for a long moment, just smiling, notebook pressed to her chest. Her fight wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt like she belonged. The next few days moved like a dream. Amara's face appeared on the university's internal news site under the headline, "Against all odds, youngest admit to Preston University's mathematics department." Some students clapped for her when she entered lecture halls. Others remained distant, holding tight to their resentment. But for the first time, Amara didn't flinch under their stares. Her new student ID card arrived in the mailroom, her name printed clean across the front. Amara Johnson, undergraduate mathematics program. She carried it in her wallet like a shield. Her dorm assignment changed. No more visitor housing, now real student housing. A small single room on the third floor of Maple Hall with a view of the campus quad. On her first day of class as an official Preston student, she walked through the grand archways of Whitaker Hall again. This time, her steps were steady, confident. Inside, Professor Aldridge stood at the front of the lecture hall. His expression, as always, remained unreadable. As he began the lecture, tackling an advanced proof on wave function stability, he paused midway and turned toward the students. "There is," he said dryly, "a simpler path to this solution. But it's subtle. Unlikely any of you will spot it on your first try." Without meaning to, half the class glanced toward Amara. She kept her head down, smiling faintly to herself. Later that evening, as she sat on a bench overlooking the main campus lawn, her phone buzzed. A text from Dr. Monroe. "There's a research assistant spot opening next month in my department. Interested?" Amara grinned, typing back, "Absolutely." She closed her phone and pulled out her notebook, flipping to a blank page. Somewhere across campus, she could still hear Ethan Rowe's voice in her head, that mocking tone. "Don't try to be a hero. It's impossible to solve." Amara smiled to herself. Impossible. Right. The sun dipped low behind the library towers as she began scribbling her next set of equations. Her fight wasn't over, but now she had a seat at the table, and she wasn't giving it up. Not today, not ever. And that, dear friends, is how one young girl, armed with nothing but grit, late-night study sessions, and a love for numbers, turned the academic world upside down. Her story reminds us of one powerful truth. Greatness isn't measured by where you come from, but by how far you're willing to go. So, if this story moved you even a little, please do us a small favor. Give this video a thumbs up, leave a comment sharing where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss another inspiring story from our channel. Thank you so much for being part of this journey. And until next time, remember, never let anyone tell you what's impossible.